let me begin just with my general conceptual framework for thinking about what a liberal democracy is. I think that a well-functioning liberal democracy is actually a collection of three actually heterogeneous institutions. So the first institution is the state. The state is about, as Max Weber said, a legitimate monopoly of force over territory. I think that's still the best definition of a state because it really distinguishes states from other kinds of social organizations. States are about power. It is about the power to enforce laws, to protect the community against internal and external threats, to deliver services like health, education, infrastructure, and so forth. The second important institution is the rule of law. To be true rule of law, law has to apply not just to ordinary people, but to the most powerful political actors in the system. If they are exempt, so if the president or the prime minister or the king, whatever, can make up the rules as they go along, then that is not the rule of law. And so the rule of law actually is an institution for limiting power, and it pushes in the opposite direction of the state. The state tries to increase and use power, and the rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on power. The third set of institutions has to do with democratic accountability, which we understand today as a set of free and fair multi-party elections. These procedures are intended to produce substantive accountability, meaning that the political system ought to respond not just to the elites that happen to be running the system, but to the whole community in as representative a way as possible. And so if you think about the structure of liberal democracy, it requires a balance. It requires a balance on the one hand between the state, which is the power generating and utilizing institution, and the rule of law and democratic accountability on the other hand, which are the power limiting and the power constraining institutions. And if you get out of balance, you're not going to have a happy situation. So obviously, if you have only a modern state, but no instruments of constraint, no rule of law, no democracy, you're basically where China is today. You've got a dictatorship that can get pretty nasty. On the other hand, if you don't have a state and you only have the institutions of constraint, or you have some of the institutions of constraint, you're also not in a good place because you could be Syria and Libya, where the state is broken down completely, or you could be a place like Nigeria, where you've got a semblance of a state and you've got a semblance of law and a semblance of democracy, but such high levels of corruption that you can't even do something like fight Boko Haram on your own territory. And in fact, I think a lot of the global instability that we are seeing is really related to the fact that you've got a very wide band of countries that now includes a very large part of the Arab world, but much of sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so forth, where you basically don't have coherent states that cannot guarantee security on their own territories. Now, there's one more important distinction, which is between a traditional or a patrimonial state and a modern state. So a patrimonial state is a state in which the political system is regarded as a species of private property. It's patrimony, and therefore, and in the days when you had kings and queens, the king could actually give a province to his daughter as a wedding present because he owned that territory and all the inhabitants, and he could give it away to somebody else if he wanted. So today, nobody dares to say, I own this country. They have what political scientists now call neo-patrimonialism, in which you've got the outward form of a modern state, but in fact, everybody is in it to get rich. That the state is basically a rent-sharing coalition by which elites dole out economic favors to one another, and that is their motivation for being in politics. And a modern state, by contrast, is one that is impersonal, that treats citizens equally on the basis of their citizenship, and not whether they have some kind of a personal relationship, friends or family, with the person that happens to be in power. And I think actually, in looking around the world, that the transition from a patrimonial state to a modern state is actually a much more difficult transition than from an autocracy to a democracy. I mean, I've spent most of my life wanting to promote democracy and thinking that elections are good things. And if you think about Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, we actually held elections that, or election-like events that produced governments that had some degree of actual democratic legitimacy. The one thing we completely failed at doing was to make modern states in these countries, states that were uncorrupt, that could deliver services, that could provide security over their whole territory. This is the big political development failure. So this modern state that is impersonal is really, I think, the thing that has undermined many societies, caused poverty, and is one of the weaknesses in democratic systems. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in Ukraine, where it's been in the news considerably, there was a Rose Revolution in 2004 where all these young Ukrainians came out on the streets after a stolen election. They forced out Viktor Yanukovych. There was a new election. You had the Orange Coalition put into place. But they absolutely could not deal with the problem of corruption. They were corrupt themselves, they squabbled, they failed to deliver basic services, and as a result, Yanukovych was reelected in 2010, and you had to do it all over again at the end of 2013. Those same young people had to come out again and force him out. And the real issue between us and the Russians at the moment is not democracy, because Yanukovych was elected fair and square. Vladimir Putin, if he were to be, if there was an election in Russia tomorrow, would probably be reelected with a very substantial majority. So the issue is not democracy. It is the fact that both the old Ukraine and actually, unfortunately, a lot of the current Ukraine and Russia and many of the states in that region are neo-patrimonial. They are rent-sharing cliques in which elites basically are padding their own nests. And the struggle in Ukraine that all these young people, were willing to die over was not so much democracy as the fact that they didn't want to live in that kind of a kleptocracy, that they wanted to live in a state where there was a clear distinction between public and private and where public officials acted in the public interest. And so I think that that's actually the big dividing line in the world right now. Of course, democracy versus authoritarian government matters a great deal. There are many governments that violate the rights of their citizens that aren't democratically responsive. But actually, this ability to deliver state services in this modern impersonal way, I think, is at the core of many of the world's problems today. But I think that the experience of the United States in the progressive era is really the model for how do you get out of this kind of a bind of pervasive clientelism. So the story begins with economic change and with social change. By the 1880s, the United States was being transformed from a primarily agrarian society into a modern urban industrial one. The agent of change was the railroads. The railroads were the internet of that day. They created national markets. This is the way that farmers in the Midwest could get their crops to international markets. And for the first time, you got an extensive division of labor, people moving to cities, the emergence of a middle class, and so forth. And under those conditions, you developed a lot of social groups that did not have an entrenched interest in the old patronage system. But the problem with political reform, and the reason that you cannot get rid of these old corrupt systems that easily, is that all of the incumbent stakeholders have a very powerful interest in maintaining it. It is a political issue. It is not a technical issue. It's not that they don't understand what good government looks like, and no amount of lecture. This is the World Bank's problem. They sort of thought that they would just lecture these countries about good governance, and they'd say, oh, okay, that's how you do it, so let's... The reason that you can't get to good government is it is not in anybody's self-interest, at least of the existing political stakeholders. Given the American political system, it took another 2 generations to really extend classified offices to 80% of the federal bureaucracy. And even today, we had many, many more political appointees. I mean, in the case of ambassadors, it's just embarrassing. It doesn't matter which party is in power. We still have about 4,000 or 5,000 appointees that turn over with every change of administration between parties, which is way, way more than almost any other democracy. But we still managed to get the number down to 4,000 in this period. And I think that this is the pattern that any country that wants to get rid of this kind of pervasive clientelism is going to have to adopt. As a result of economic and social change, you restack the social deck, you get new actors that do not have an interest in the old system, that want it changed. And so in the late 19th century, you had, the railroads were, they had learned to play the corruption game very well. In fact, Stanford University, so Leland Stanford, was one of these railroad barons that basically owned the California state legislature. But there are a lot of people that were being screwed by this kind of behavior, shippers and smaller businesses and so forth. And they formed part of a progressive coalition that included Midwestern farmers, urban reformers, intellectuals, people like Frank Goodenow, Woodrow Wilson, who at that time was a professor of public administration at Johns Hopkins, and then went on to Princeton and so forth. And so you had several things that had to come together. First, you had a grassroots movement. And this is one of the things that we don't appreciate about that time. All of these grandmothers around the United States were really upset that their fourth-class postmaster was some political hack, and they thought this was terrible and that this ought to change. And they organized and they wrote letters and they demonstrated in favor of this kind of change. The second thing was you needed an idea. And at that time, actually, it was people like Wilson and Goodenow and so forth that brought these ideas of modern government from Europe to the United States and made them respectable and made Americans feel kind of bad that they didn't have this kind of a modern government. You needed leadership. One of the most important leaders was Teddy Roosevelt, who was assembled this, he was actually at one point the chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission. He believed that civil service reform was an incredibly important issue, and that he made a centerpiece of his own presidency. And so it's this combination of grassroots mobilization, leadership, and ideas, I think, that created that kind of coalition that made that possible. And I think that that's what's going to happen in places like Brazil and India in the next decade or two. And you already see the beginnings of this. You already see grassroots mobilization, mostly of middle-class people that don't want the old corrupt system. It's not going to work in the short run. It took 40, 50 years for the United States to get rid of this system in our own history, so it's not going to be a quick process. But as far as I can see, if you don't approach this thing politically, it's not going to happen.